Good morning. Governor Cooper has proclaimed November as American Indian Heritage Month. This month-long celebration highlights the contributions of American Indians to our culture and society. The Office of State Human Resources is pleased to present today's virtual EEO Network Lunch and Learn event, American Indian Heritage Month, an update on federal policy priorities. Our special guest speaker is Katherine Isom Claus, and she is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs for Policy and Economic Development at the U.S. Department of the Interior. She will discuss the administration's commitment to uphold the rights and dignity of Indigenous people, make respect for tribal sovereignty and self-governments the cornerstone of federal Indian policy, honor trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations, and more. I'm very pleased again to have our speaker today. But before we start our program, I would like to go over a little housekeeping. As usual, you know that today we will be recording this event, so you will be able to watch this event on demand at a later date, and I will get that information out to you. And if you have any questions throughout the program, please present any of your questions to our chat, and we will make sure that those questions are addressed. I'm going to turn the program over to Greg Richardson, the Executive Director of the North Carolina Commissions of Indian Affairs, and he will give us some remarks and then present our speaker this morning. Greg?
Thank you, Ms. Wills. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you this year as part of your Indian Heritage Month program at the Office of State Human Resources. It's always a pleasure to be part of a program when we're talking about Indian Heritage Month here in North Carolina, as well as being a part of a national forum to talk about Indian policy. It's very important to give this recognition, not only just in November, 1 month out of the year, but certainly for each month during the year at all times. So thank you all for setting this up. And as you've already mentioned, Wendy, Governor Cooper's issued a proclamation recognizing the month of November as Indian Heritage Month in this state. We'll have a huge celebration on the 21st at the North Carolina Museum of History, which will be held virtually this year because of the pandemic, but it will provide an opportunity for the public and our citizens to learn more about American Indians and the heritage, this rich Indian heritage that we have here in the state of North Carolina. This morning, it gives me great pleasure to make some comments about our guest speaker and introduce Katherine Isom Claus. She's Taos from a centuries-old Pueblo and an Indian settlement near the Rio Grande in New Mexico. She is Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior for Indian Affairs and works on policy and economic development. As Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, she fulfills a number of responsibilities. And as Assistant Secretary, her duties include strengthening the government relationship and nation building with Indian tribes and Alaskan natives. She advocates for policies that support American Indian self-determination and tribal sovereignty, protects and preserves American Indian trust assets held by the federal government for the benefit of American Indians, and administers a wide array of laws, regulations, functions relating to American Indians and Alaskan natives throughout the United States. Today, the Deputy Secretary will present an update on federal policy, as has been mentioned, and is supported through the Biden administration's commitment of upholding the rights and the dignity of Indigenous people here in the United States. Katherine Claus most recently was the Vice Chair of the National Indian Gaming Association, which is a national organization that addresses Indian gaming issues throughout the United States. And then she served as the Senior Counselor to the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the Department of Interior prior to that, where she chaired an interagency working group on sacred sites, homelessness, advising on Indian gaming matters and tribal homeland registrations. Before joining the federal government, She provided legal advice and representation to tribal clients on a wide range of federal Indian law and policy issues important to American Indians in Indian country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Katherine Isom Claus as our 2021 Indian Heritage Month speaker. Welcome, Ms. Claus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Richardson and Ms. Wills. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you here today. It's really an honor to be your keynote speaker. I have a variety of things I'm going to talk about in terms of what we do in our office, just kind of a broad overview, and I'll focus on a couple of areas. And then I believe we have time for questions and answers after this, so I'm happy to talk about anything you'd like during that time. So as Mr. Richardson mentioned, my name is Katherine Isom Claus, and I am Taos Pueblo. I serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Economic Development under the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, very long title, as we do in the federal government. So at the Department of the Interior, I am extremely lucky to be able to work under the leadership of Secretary Deb Holland. And as you may know, the Secretary made history when she became the first American Indian to serve as a U.S. Cabinet Secretary ever. She's from the Pueblo of Laguna, and she grew up in a military family. She was also one of two of the first Native American women to serve in Congress. Now, as Secretary, her priorities are to work to tackle the climate crisis, carry out the U.S. trust relationship to tribal nations, develop a clean energy future, and lead U.S. action to restore and conserve America's lands, waters, and wildlife, including the America the Beautiful initiative undertaken under President Biden. So right now, she is currently at COP26, working to implement all of those priorities, along with our Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, who's also in Scotland with her, Brian Newland. He is a former chairman of the Bay Mills Indian community, and I believe he may be the only Assistant Secretary to come directly from being a tribal leader to a federal government leader in his Senate confirmed position now. So I'm extremely lucky, as is our whole team, to be able to work with such wonderful leaders who are really dedicated to serving Indian people every day. So I think Mr. Richardson outlined a bit of our office's mission at the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. Our primary duties are to fulfill the department's trust responsibilities to tribes and to individuals. We have 574 American Indian and Alaska Native tribes that we maintain a direct government-to-government relationship with. So it's quite a lot to manage, and it's really a range of cultures, of land bases, of people across from, all the way from Alaska to the East Coast. It's one thing I always want to tell people about Indian country is it's incredibly diverse. So in our office, we also advocate for tribes and tribal nations for their self-determination, their sovereignty. We hold their trust assets, and so we're charged with maintaining those assets and keeping them for the benefit of tribes and individual Indians. Today, we're committed to ensuring that the priorities of tribal governments are what truly leads our work. This is because we know that tribal governments know best what the needs are of their own communities and how best to make substantive and lasting change in their own communities. Over time, the federal government has changed in that position a lot. So, we certainly started off from an antagonistic position in the beginning days of the United States and before the United States with tribal nations, but over a very long history that maybe we can talk about later if folks aren't familiar, we eventually arrived at a place where our aim is to truly support tribal nations, to empower them, and to let them guide the way to realizing their own futures. So one of the ways we do that is through the White House Council on Native American Affairs. And this was established under President Obama, but was dormant in the previous administration. President Biden has revived it and I think built upon it, renewed it and made it even bigger. The White House Council was established to improve the coordination of federal programs and use available federal resources for the benefit of tribal communities. The council ensures that tribal consultation, grounded in the special nation-to-nation relationship between the U.S. government and tribal nations, continues to guide federal decision-making in addressing the needs of Native peoples. Currently, this council is co-chaired by the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Holland, and White House Domestic Policy Advisor, Ambassador Susan Rice. It consists of heads of federal departments and agencies and offices, as well as a staff consisting of executive director and a couple other staff members who carry forward the priorities grounded in the trust responsibility and treaty rights. Their work is also informed by consistent and substantive engagement with tribal nations. That collaboration sets the foundation for effective federal investments in tribal communities and effective policies that impact tribes. The White House Council also supports and organizes the annual White House Tribal Leaders Summit, which provides an opportunity for leaders from all federally recognized tribes to interact directly with the president and representatives from the highest levels of the administration, including several cabinet secretaries. So that council convenes their principals, which are the secretaries, at least 3 times a year per an executive order. And they organize their work under a few different priority areas. So flowing from President Biden's 4 priorities, which are tackling COVID-19, addressing the climate change, advancing racial equity, and supporting strong economic recovery, the council formed 6 subtopics to carry out their initiatives. And these were based on what we've been hearing the most from tribes, is there the most need, opportunity to collaborate across the federal government and improve services for tribes. So those are climate change, tribal homelands and treaties, that's 1, and economic development, energy and infrastructure, education, health, international indigenous issues, and public safety and justice. So that kind of gives you a flavor of what tribal governments are prioritizing. As governments, they deal with just the same issues as state or federal governments deal with in providing services to their people. As you saw, infrastructure, energy, lands, these are all kind of big picture issues that tribal nations are focused on day to day. So again, the mission of that council is to work collaboratively interagency and across the executive branch, engage in regular and meaningful tribal federal engagement, and foster an all-of-government approach in meeting our treaty and trust obligations to tribes. So I would like to move on to an overview of the other things we're working on directly in terms of our issue areas right now. Our top priorities include meaningful tribal consultation. That's the foundation of the Biden administration's commitment to upholding treaty and trust responsibilities to tribal nations. Under President Biden's executive memorandum on tribal consultation, the department has backed up this commitment with action. So we're currently taking steps and have taken steps to strengthen our consultation policy, and we'll detail those steps a bit more in the future. So by consultation, maybe I should clarify what we mean is whenever the federal government takes an action that may have any impact on a tribal nation or tribal nations broadly, we have a duty and obligation to consult, to speak with tribes in a formal government-to-government way and take their views into consideration in a very meaningful way into any decisions that we're making. So I mentioned the White House Council on Native American Affairs, and that one of their duties is to convene the White House Tribal Nations Summit. That's coming up November 15 and 16. So it's very soon for us. It's going to be all virtual this year for a change, of course, due to COVID, which I think, as we've all seen, the virtual environments have some benefits and some drawbacks. It was certainly wonderful to see in the Obama administration leaders from nearly each of the 574 tribal nations come to DC to get to meet face-to-face with each other all in one spot and with leaders from across the federal government. This time it'll all be virtual, but I think it allows for greater participation, and it's also going to be streamed over social media channels. So I encourage you, if you're interested in taking a look at that, to look it up. I don't have the links right now. We haven't figured out quite each of the outlets for that, but we can certainly send an update for anyone who's interested once we have those links. It's, I think, going to be a really wonderful discussion. Another priority area for the Secretary is addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. Within the first 100 days of the administration, Secretary Holland established the Missing and Murdered Unit within the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Service. This unit is hard at work investigating unsolved cases, collecting data, and coordinating services with families of victims. I know we have kind of a big audience here, and so I don't want to over or under explain here, so we can always return to anything if folks are interested in hearing more. But just very broadly, I think it's been in the media a lot, so folks are probably aware. But within Indian country and among Indian people, there's really a crisis of just individuals going missing and being murdered, being victims of other violence, and these cases, for a variety of reasons, are just not resolved. So families don't know, what happened to their family members. We often don't see justice in a court system. So this team is coordinating with other components of the federal government to try to address that crisis and ensure that justice is fully realized within Indian country. So furthermore, on that point, in conjunction with the Department of Justice, we're working to implement the Not Invisible Act, which is something that the Secretary worked on in Congress. It mandates the creation of a joint commission that includes federal and non-federal members to focus on reducing violent crime in Indian country. And we held a series of consultations on the formation of that commission and are working to finalize the membership, and so there'll be more on that soon. Another one that I think I'll spend a bit of time on because it's, again, been in the media so much and is so important to so many people, is the Secretary's Federal Boarding School Initiative. She announced that in June, I believe, that we will begin to conduct a comprehensive review and investigation into the federal government's devastating boarding school policies that continue to impact Indian country today. Our team within the Indian Affairs Office is tasked with preparing a detailed report of federal boarding school records with an express focus on cemeteries and potential burial sites. This is an extremely difficult topic for folks. I had the opportunity to be introduced to it in a professional role right when I first started. The Secretary was invited to the site of the former Carlisle Indian School, where there is a cemetery where children who attended that boarding school were buried, often not with particular gravestones noting, all of the information that the families would need to reclaim them. So as part of this massive project, we're working to identify all of those remains and begin the process of bringing those children home to their communities. So at that time, we went out for a ceremony for several children from the Sichangu community, who are from the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and the youth of that tribe actually led the efforts to repatriate these young people who had died at the boarding schools and bring them back to their communities. So it was a really beautiful ceremony and a great way to kind of launch my work in this area, along with many people at the department who are working on this project. So to back up a little bit, for a long time, the federal government's guiding policy in operating these Indian boarding schools was to erase the tribal identity of Indian students. This, is purported to be for the purpose of things like civilizing people for assimilation and these purposes that, are repudiated now and certainly had horrific consequences at the time for the children, their families, and the tribal nations as a whole. There isn't a Native person today whose life has not been shaped in some way by the legacy of these Indian boarding schools. Tribal communities are continuing to heal from the trauma that these schools inflicted upon them. So Secretary Holland has given us this great honor and responsibility of beginning this effort at uncovering the history of these boarding schools. It's in a way that's never really been done before. There have been many efforts from private organizations and individuals and tribes, but the federal government itself has not undertaken an effort like this. And it's a huge project. So I'll get into in a second. So this part of it that we're beginning is just the first step. We don't, we're not working with any funding or anything new. We're just kind of devoting as much time as we possibly can to begin to take the preliminary steps to address this issue adequately and with care. So the secretaries directed us to identify and gather information about the department's past oversight and implementation of the programs. The first part of this work is identifying boarding school sites, historical records, and enrollment lists of the students who are at each of these schools, and any other documents that can help us evaluate the loss of human life as well. So a lot of our records in the federal government dealing with Native Americans and tribes are held in the American Indian Records Repository, which is a big cave-like facility in Kansas. So we've actually had to have folks physically go out there because we have all of these paper records, digitize them so they can be read, on a computer. And I'm told that they're going through 39,000 boxes, 273 million images as part of that massive project. So as our research team is undergoing that effort, the next phase of the work is to identify and protect burial sites, including those that have been forgotten. So before proceeding into this work, we're consulting with tribes on issues like appropriate protocols and cultural issues, repatriation, and compliance with the various laws dealing with Native American graves and cultural protection. So as we move forward, we're trying to do this very carefully and being very mindful of all of the sensitivities on this work. We're also looking to find ways to ensure support for mental health, because bringing these issues to light may be traumatic, and it's important that we do this in a way that promotes healing. We've had requests from Senator Warren, Congresswoman Davids, and other members of Congress to work together with Indian Health Service on those resources too. So I think that they're setting up a culturally competent hotline and other supports that will be in place. We've also tried to put those resources in place for our own employees who are engaged in this work. So I think, like many of you, our employees are Native themselves, and while they're doing this work professionally, have personal experiences that they're dealing with as part of that too. So, so during these consultations are coming up on November 17, 18, and 23rd. For anyone who wants to pass that along to your tribal nations, if they're not already aware of that. It is a government-to-government consultation, so it's we're not seeking comments from individuals at that time, but want to respect the diplomatic nature of that government-to-government relationship. So we'll again be looking at ways to address protocols on handling sensitive information, cultural concerns, repatriation of remains, and a variety of other privacy concerns and cultural concerns. So as part of this work, we've had an outpouring of folks reaching out to want to help. And I think I can, if anyone is interested, I think I can provide an email address for that if you are interested in that sort of support or want information. I mean, we don't have a lot of information to share yet because we are still in kind of a research and record gathering phase, but we're always happy to talk with folks and see how we may be able to collaborate or incorporate information that's held out there that might be outside of our immediate reach. So we are in the process of partnering with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, who's done this work, I think, for a decade at least now, and is really expert in the subject area, and it's been incredibly helpful with their work. So I want to acknowledge them as we continue to do that. So the first endpoint of our project is going to be by April 2022. We're going to write a report to the Secretary detailing the truth of what we find, which will allow us to begin to take the next steps, which will almost certainly involve more research and seeking recommendations on how to move forward more, because I think it's going to be a long process that will take many years. So my final point on that is that I want to let you know that the Bureau of Indian Affairs is operated under our office, the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, and also operates what we call residential schools today. These are entirely different from the boarding schools of the past. These residential schools that we operate now are intended to promote quality education to students from across Indian country, empowering them to better themselves and their community. We want to support these schools as we move forward in this work, and not have them conflated in any way with the boarding schools of the past, which were entirely for an opposite purpose. So our youth today in the residential schools are practicing their spirituality, learning their language, carrying their culture forward, and that's something we'll continue to support. Okay, last, I think, but not least, on our priority list is our topic of restoring tribal homelands. We have an obligation to do that through trust and treaty obligations, but it's something that's important to all of us as well. As you probably well know, a tribal land base is the foundation of tribal sovereignty for tribal nations. So we're currently in the process of holding consultations on how we can do a better job on tribal homelands restoration. What specific priorities should guide our work, what we should focus on, how we can increase protections for sacred sites and treaty rights. So we're going to have a lot more to come about that in the next several weeks as well. So yeah, and just to sum up there, so taking land into trust on behalf of tribes, which means the federal government holds the land for the benefit of tribal nations who have all of the authority for it, but the federal government holding it protects that land from loss for the tribal nations, protects it from being taxed by the state, and has a variety of other purposes for tribal nations. That's critical for self-determination, allowing a tribe to build up its economic base and protect the land against variety of ways that it could be alienated or tribal sovereignty could be undermined. Just to sum up, so at Interior, we honor these themes every day of supporting tribal citizens and tribal nations, building up tribal sovereignty, supporting, letting tribes guide the way that we move forward in our work. We're respecting Indigenous knowledge in our work to fight climate change and as part of Build Back Better. We're conducting robust tribal consultation, and we work hard to adhere to our trust and treaty responsibilities. We center our work on the voices of Indigenous people as we address the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis and take action to help people heal from the Indian boarding school history and the policies that the United States has since repudiated. I think we have a really bright future ahead of us with our secretary and our assistant secretary and all of our really wonderful team here at the department. And it feels like we're just really beginning, still early in the administration, have lots of things that we're hoping to accomplish, and we'll roll out in the coming weeks, really, with the Tribal Nations Summit. We're going to have a lot of exciting announcements to come. So with that, I think I will stop the remarks, and we see if we're ready to move to Q&A.
Hey, thank you, Catherine. Let's give Catherine a round of applause, virtual round of applause for her presentation. Thank you so much, Catherine. Now we'll have you respond, if you will, to a couple of questions that we've already received. And I know that there's going to be some other questions, perhaps that's already been placed over into the chat. So I'm going to rely on Wendy to help me with that. And I guess to kick this off, I will just jump in there and ask you a question about your last item. And this was the recovering tribal homelands, restoring tribal homelands. My question to you on that is, the Bureau of Land Management, I think it's BLM, I think has a responsibility for advocating and safeguarding many of the surveys, old tribal surveys, land surveys that are many years old, of course. And of course, I've received some feedback that some of those old surveys are perhaps out of date. So for federally recognized tribes that are now developing new properties, developing their tribal land, there is some disputes going on in relation to the boundary lines of some of the surveys. So I was just going to ask you if the restoration of tribal homelands, if that particular priority will be designed to take a look at those old surveys to make sure, number one, that the information is being safeguarded, held, and number two, to make sure that there's no restrictions placed on property owners, American Indians who might want to develop their land. And I know that land is handled differently depending on the tribe, depending on the region of the country. So if you would maybe talk about that a little bit.
Sure, that's a great question. I'm taking notes here too to make sure that we follow up on that. I think overarchingly, yes, I think that's certainly implicated as part of this work. One of the points you mentioned is, not having restrictions on property owners. That's something we've been seeing come up a lot, and something that we're working to address. We, don't want to see any restrictive covenants or various other ways like liens or effects happen on lands. So yes, we are actively working on trying to address that. In terms of working with BLM on the surveys, I think that should absolutely be a part of this. That wasn't part of the consultation that we undertook because, that was just our office, in BLM, as you said, is a different office. But I think that under the Secretary's leadership, we can harmonize all of these pieces and should do that going forward. So I'm actually going to make a note of that for our team to follow up on, that we make sure that we are considering that as part of this work. So thank you for that great question.
Thank you. And Catherine, the next one is from one of our participants. And this is an information awareness question. The writer said, with that said, are there any programs, awareness campaigns, or initiatives planned or in place at the Bureau of Indian Affairs to help address, correct, or eliminate some of the misconceptions about American Indian people, indigenous people?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. In terms of awareness campaigns, that's definitely something we try to do at various points. I don't know that there's anything I can kind of specifically direct someone to right off the top of my head, but I can certainly follow up if you're looking for that specifically. It's, we're kind of in the process of updating our website too, so not everything is as available as I would like it to be immediately. It's certainly part of our role to advocate for the correct representation of tribal nations today, and I know our staff does engage in that and has done so in person, through speaking engagements in various ways. So I think the answer is yes, but my caveat is I don't know where I can kind of direct you to if you're looking for that specifically, but we can certainly follow up with folks if you're interested in it.
Sure. Thank you, Catherine. The next question is dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic. And the question is about how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted tribes, federally recognized tribes throughout the country?
Yeah, I mean, it's had a huge impact. We know that Native people were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So there was an early push as vaccines were being introduced to get lots of them to tribal communities and to educate folks on their safety and why they should get them. So yes, the answer is it's had a disproportionate effect. It's hit tribal nations really hard. It's it's caused, we all know the effects it's had on economic development throughout the country. So that applies equally, if not more so, within Indian country. I was still in my previous role at the National Indian Gaming Commission when this hit, and I think we had every single gaming facility in the entire country except for one, and I think that particular one was in a very remote area of Alaska, but closed down all of their operations. And as folks probably know in this group, tribal gaming is a huge economic driver of Indian country. It's the biggest source of income by far to tribal nations as a whole. Of course, that varies from tribe to tribe, but so all of those being closed for, in many cases, if not most cases, periods of several months, was a huge hit economically too. So I think the health effects on tribal people were huge, on tribal economic development was huge. It's taken a big toll. Luckily, tribes have received some aid through the various funding packages from Congress. So I think folks are starting to get back on their feet from that. But that's still a process, as with the rest of the country, to recover from this ongoing pandemic.
Very good, very good. And the next question is kind of related in a way. We often hear about the plight of underrepresented minorities and the challenges they face. Why don't we hear more about the realities and concerns about American Indians and the challenges that they face?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? Why don't we? I don't know. It's all I do every day, but I think we have a problem, in like mainstream media coverage, that Native Americans are often just left out of the narrative. I know oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember this example recently on the media about, it kind of went through, there was a graphic, I can't remember which news channel it was, but it was, it said like African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans, and there was a something else category, Natives weren't even listed. So we see that quite a lot, and it's frustrating. I think all we can really do is try to promote correct narratives about tribal nations and modern Native people today. It is frustrating.
We have a similar issue here in our state as well. Wanted to get you to talk a little bit, Katherine, about the 2020 census and maybe your views in terms of how Indian country did in relation to the 2020 census as it relates to your work at the Bureau of USA.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't been too involved with the census work. I think, going kind of tying out on the last point, I think it's really important for us to have accurate data, because that's what can drive funding for Indian country. It's how we know where to target resources, and how we can provide data to back up anything that we are requesting on, from the executive branch. So it's incredibly important. I think I can't really speak in too detailed a way on the census, because I haven't been very involved with it. But my understanding is that we did, see increases this year, and those would be used appropriately for a variety of purposes throughout the federal government to hopefully increase resources and representation, and get services more appropriately targeted to the right places. I wish I could be a little bit more specific on the census, but I think we did well. There was a big effort to get the word out in Indian country, certainly to participate in the census, and we want to continue to do that in the future. It's very important.
Very good points. I think I want to bring you back to a policy issue here, or question. This one's going to relate to Indian child welfare. This is an area that we work on here in our state, the Indian Commission. And as you know, throughout the United States, there are huge, huge challenges in relation to Indian child welfare. And you spoke about the boarding schools and the whole history about our boarding schools earlier. But looks like we still have major challenges going on in terms of how our systems are addressing children that fall within the social services realm, and we are seeing a lot of American Indians in our state who are being placed outside of tribal communities in foster homes or even adopted outside of the tribal communities. And so I was just wondering, with Secretary Halen's push on policy initiatives, how is Indian child welfare being plugged into that? And I'll end that particular that part of my question or statement with one of the observations that I think is very critical. The Indian Child Welfare Act itself is a very, very good piece of legislation, but I wonder if it is going far enough. For example, I do not see any nexus between federal law with Indian child welfare and state laws. So when a federally recognized tribal member or child ends up in our state, unless the tribe that the child is from exercises jurisdiction, that child then is going to be placed most likely with a non-Indian family. So do you foresee any changes perhaps coming forth as it relates to the Indian Child Welfare Act, make it more comprehensive?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yeah, of course, this area is incredibly important too. I can't really speak to changes in the legislation just because that's, it wouldn't come from our side of the federal government. But, certainly we want to do our best to implement it as strongly as we can. I think, like you identified, there's a lot of education efforts that need to happen because it's not always understood where states fit in, who has authority when. So I think there's, a huge education effort that needs to happen. A lot of universities are working on that as well. We are working to, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much, but we would really like to have a specialist on just ICWA in our office. That's, how important it is. We have been still staffing up our team. We just had, a couple of folks start just a couple of weeks ago. So we're still assembling our team and want to build up our expertise in that area because it is critically important to make sure these children have the opportunity to stay with their own tribes and not be taken outside, and that's contrary to the law.
Very good. Very good. Thank you for that. I'm going to check in with Wendy Wills to see if we have any other questions coming in the chat. Wendy, do you have anything for me, or would you like to go ahead and ask maybe some of those questions?
Oh, yes, Greg, I have several questions. So I'm going to go back and take a step to some of these questions I have here. The first question I have is, what has happened with the challenges by tribes against drilling on reservations and tribal lands?
Well, it varies. That's a really, really great question too, because it's in the media a lot. It's critically important to many tribal nations and people to protect their lands and waters and air and habitats for wildlife, and it's really ties into a lot of things that we need to uphold as part of our trust and treaty responsibilities. I think each situation varies, and at the department, of course, we have various roles to play with this. So I can say broadly, as the department, we're doing our best to relook at things that can still be considered, that may have been considered previously, to make sure that they actually were done in a way that respects tribal sovereignty, that truly involves tribal consultation and isn't just imposing something on a tribe. So I think there's been an effort, broadly speaking, to examine past efforts where we can, and to set the stage for in the future, making sure that tribal views are considered appropriately as part of this process. I think President Biden has been prioritizing other kinds of energy as well, but certainly hasn't made just kind of one definitive statement about this generally. So I think our role is to be as strong as we can for tribal nations and advocating for their interests, and the Secretary tends to do that as well.
Wendy and Katherine, if I may, I'd like to piggyback on that question. Catherine, a lot of our listeners may not understand what a treaty, tribal treaty is, and may not understand what tribal sovereignty is. So you might want to maybe talk
Sure.
about that.
Okay. Yeah, and that's as I've been saying this the whole time. So let's take a step back from treaties. Of course, going back to when Europeans first came to this continent, and over the years developed into various forms of government. I think the actual treaties came once we had the United States. But so a treaty is an agreement between a tribal nation and the federal government, and each tribal nation may have their own treaty, or they may be part of group treaties in some cases, and not all actually have treaties. But this is an agreement between governments. So this is an obligation that the United States has as its highest responsibility to uphold. It supersedes any other law. So that's something that we are charged with upholding, these agreements. And they vary. Different tribal nations have different considerations in each of their treaties. So that's part of our work, is to catalog all of these treaties too, so we can better understand which obligations are in which of these agreements with different tribal nations, so that we can quickly see them and know that we're actually working to uphold those specific terms of agreements. An important point about treaties too is that they should be interpreted to the benefit of tribes. So language may have been ambiguous. When we look at it now with modern eyes, we need to look at it as a tribe may have understood it, as the tribal leaders negotiating this treaty would have understood the terms to be. Treaties and so trust obligation, right, was the other question.
Yeah,
so related to that, our obligation from the federal government, of course, took a lot of Indian lands in many years ago, and because of this exchange, it was meant to be an exchange where the federal government then provided things like education, health services, other lands in exchange for certain lands, perhaps, then held these former tribal lands. So our obligation is to manage those lands as best we can, any assets for tribes as best we can, and in all of our dealings with tribal nations, make sure that we're upholding the duties as a trustee would. So that's kind of like certain financial obligations and certain duties of care in these dealings. So it's really meant to be the highest standard of dealing that we have. Hopefully that helps. Complicated topic.
Yes, I agree. Okay, Wendy, you have another question for us?
Yes. With everything that's going on now within Congress, does DOI see the most impactful way for the Build Back funds to be spent? What does the DOI see as the most impactful way for the Build Back funds to be spent in Indian country? Is DOI making recommendations on how those funds should be spent?
That's a great question too. I can't really speak to any recommendations. I think, going back to our overarching purposes before, we are really looking to tribes to kind of guide where money should go. So we want to support infrastructure development, all of the priorities that are listed, but then as much as we can allow tribes themselves to direct where they think money should go.
Catherine,
short answer on that one. I know it'll be a lot more to come on this.
Catherine, I'll just toss this one in too. It's not totally related, but I know that the Bureau is moving in a direction in terms of contracting, doing more contract work with tribes in relation to social services activities, for example, and providing an opportunity for tribes to more or less determine their own destiny or design their own programs with those types of funding through contracts. So you might want to talk about that. I know the Eastern Band of Turkey here has been doing a lot of that with their social service program.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So tribes have the ability to take on services that the federal government would provide and take those programs on themselves and administer them just from the tribal level as opposed to the federal level. So in those instances, the funding for that program goes through the federal government to tribes. And we think that's fantastic. We want to encourage that. That's one of the offices that is part of what I oversee. So I think a lot of times in the federal government, our goal is to get out of the way and to just let tribes manage their own affairs. So this is a way to do that within the various laws and authorities. So we can kind of transfer the federal authorities directly to the tribes. And those can be taken on in really any number of areas that the tribe wants to. It's at their own request. And we can still provide support as through the federal government and of course the funding. But that's really a fantastic way that we can help support tribal sovereignty is, and sovereignty, that was your question earlier. What is tribal sovereignty? So just, basically that's the inherent government that tribes have. That's the ability for tribes to govern their own affairs. It's not coming from anywhere else. The tribal nations themselves have that authority to govern their own affairs. So yes, those types of contracts are a way we can facilitate that.
Wendy, we have one more? I guess we might have time for one or two more.
Yes, I do have another question. Does DOI or BIA support federal recognition for the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina?
Thought I might get that question. So that's a great question, and it's so let me say that as you know, I'm sure since you're asking the question, that there have been various bills in Congress. There's currently a bill in Congress that the department will be asked to testify on. So I don't want to get ahead of that formal statement, but what I can say is President Biden has said, as when he was candidate Biden, that he supported Lumbee and the Lumbee tribe in that way. So even the department will say more on this, I think, if that bill comes to a hearing. We're looking forward to providing testimony if asked. But I can direct you to now President Biden's statements on that as where we would take our guidance from.
Katherine and Wendy, I'd like to maybe piggyback on that question a little bit. And this one, Katherine, goes back to the policy initiatives and the policy work that you're working on. I'm wondering if there's going to be any discussions or perhaps any initiatives put in place to revisit the requirements for federal recognition. From a state that has 7 state recognized tribes here in North Carolina, there's been a lot of work, a lot of concern about the current federal recognition policy. So I'm just wondering if there's going to be, with Secretary Halen at the helm, if there's going to be any look back to see perhaps if there could be some revisions to those federal recognition policies to, help more of the East Coast tribes get into the position of being federally recognized. There is a view, I don't mean to put you on the spot, I understand your position that you can't speak on legislative matters, but there is a view that many of not only North Carolina, but the policies are skewed against East Coast tribes. And we know that Virginia, for example, had numerous tribes in that state that lived on reservations for decades, and they just were able to get through the federal recognition process within the last 5-6 years. So with that example, for example, there are other tribes that have lived in communities, in the same communities for generations historically, but there's a perception from some that the standards are not really receptive to East Coast Indians, and the requirements that tribes have to put forth is really not, some things that the tribes that were not forced on the reservations back in time, and we're not forced into treaty obligations or treaty agreements back in history. I get through those. So there would seem to be some other avenues through which people could look at in terms of revising the federal recognition policies and procedures. Right now, in the Lumbee case, as well as the Virginia tribes case, the only avenue that we had to go through was through the congressional route. So just wondering if there's going to be maybe a look back at those procedures, or if that's even on the radar screen at DOI.
Sure, it's definitely on the radar. One of our counselors is Mashpee, and she specifically, one of her areas of interest is federal acknowledgement. Having, seen her own tribe go through that, she well understands how burdensome the process is, and, we all do. It's certainly an area of interest. I don't know that I can announce, kind of a specific initiative on that right now, but it's something that the Assistant Secretary is interested in keeping an eye on. Yes, it's something we'd broadly speaking, it's something we'd like to look at, but I can't say specifically that what we would do, but we're certainly listening to those concerns. What you've raised has certainly been raised many times before the department, so it's something we're aware of, and we want the process to be as fair and efficient as it can be. From private practice before coming to the federal government, that the amount of work that can go into these applications is tremendous, and it's very expensive, and the requirements, may not be what seem to fit a tribe situation. So something we are for sure aware of, and I hope that that's something that we'll be able to look more closely at in the future.
Thank you. Great response. And I'll follow up again relating to, I guess, on the administrative side, opportunities for internships and for American Indian students coming out of college. Are there internships available at Department of Interior or Bureau of Indian Affairs so that our students could apply for these internships and become part of that work there at DOI?
Yes, I love that question. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how we get to them. I know that we do offer internships. I'm not sure if COVID has changed anything, if that's kind of virtual. We've just been at the department now since July, and I know we didn't have any interns within our office this past summer, but I know I was previously with the department, and we've had interns through various programs over the years. We know we have them, and USA Jobs may be a place to look to. I would encourage you to check out our website. We really want to encourage Native students to learn about our work and get experience, and we of course benefit from their perspectives too. So yes, I can actually, maybe I can follow up with you if you're able to send out information afterwards, and see if I can get you any links to specific places where you can apply for internships, because I definitely want to encourage folks to do that.
Katherine, I really like that, because a number of our tribes, in fact, most of our tribes here in North Carolina, they administer what's called the Workforce Innovations Act. And this is a program that's funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. And through those programs, we're involved in supporting students that are entering community college and then moving on to university campuses. So we do get a lot of requests here from students who would like to come work at our Indian Commission in terms of signing on as an intern. And in fact, within the last week, we just signed a Navajo student that's attending the University of North Carolina here at Chapel Hill. So she's going to be working with us through June of this coming year.
Wonderful.
So we want to try to get that in reverse so we can get some students plugged in at the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well.
Absolutely.
Wendy, how are we doing on time? I think we're getting close, but you'll have to tell me.
They're doing really good on time. So
Good.
if there are a couple of questions, we can go ahead and answer those questions. And if not, then we can go ahead and adjourn. But we do, I'm looking now to see if we have any questions, but I wanted to say Thank you, Greg, for staying on for the Q&A, because it's been very helpful to have your answers to the questions also from the North Carolina perspective. So thank you for tag teaming those answers and that conversation with our speaker. So I appreciate that. Are there any other questions from the chat?
Wendy, if there are no other questions, I'll cap it off here for a moment here. Katherine, it's been a pleasure serving with you on the panel today. Look forward to meeting you at some point down the road. Certainly invite you to send that information that you referenced in terms of job openings and scholarship, or not scholarships, but internship opportunities with your office. We'd like to, refer some folks about that information on out to our tribes. And just for the audience as well, when we talk about North Carolina's American Indian population, we have 8 tribes here in the state, and 7 of those are state recognized and 1 is federally recognized. And all of our tribes hold membership on the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs. Those tribes are seated on the commission by way of their own tribal policies and procedures. So therefore, the tribes are not seated on the commission by way of the General Assembly, the governor, but by tribal policy. However, we do have 5 state officials serving on our commission, and I wanted to acknowledge Secretary Pam Cashwell, who is listening in today. Secretary Pam Cashwell is secretary of our department, where we are housed here at the North Carolina Department of Administration. Secretary Cashwell is Coharie and Lumbee, and she's the first American Indian to serve as secretary of this department. She's also the first American Indian woman to serve as a member of the North Carolina Cabinet. So we're proud of Secretary Cashwell here in North Carolina to have her on board. She has an extensive background in Indian affairs. She was part of our Native American Youth Organization as a student and growing up. Secretary Cashwell's mother actually worked here at the Commission of Indian Affairs many, many years ago. And so she has a long-standing track record as far as her passion and love for American Indians and nations. So I wanted to acknowledge her this morning before we adjourn as well. So we're also very pleased to know that the Biden administration is going to Deputy Secretary Halen and others to his office. Having people on board that have knowledge and background about tribes is very important. And that's the way I think we get very important work done. And you have people who know the people, know the population and the community. So with that said, I want to thank you again for being with us today. I want to thank Wendy Wills for inviting me to be part of this effort today. So enjoy your weekend, and hopefully we can get you down to North Carolina again, Katherine, in the near future. And that might be in March for our Indian Unity Conference, which we are planning right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure speaking with you. I echo Wendy's thoughts, and it's been wonderful to hear your perspective. They've been really great questions. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much.
Let's give her a round of applause, Lloyd.
And I look forward to visiting one day.
Round of applause for both of our panelists, and I really appreciate everyone attending our event today. And again, this event will be available on demand. Just look out for a note from me concerning the link for our YouTube videos, but you will be able to watch this again online. And we will have some events upcoming during the month of November. During November, we are going to be observing Transgender Awareness Week. And on November the 18th, we will have a lunch and learn session, and it will be Transgender, a conversation with Mama Gloria Allen. So look to get an invitation from me for our next event that will be coming up. And again, as always, the Office of State Human Resources is very glad to have both of you here serving on our panel. And we would just like to say thank you for taking the time out to discuss American Indian Heritage Month and American Indian Heritage events. And I would like to just make everyone aware of the events that will be coming up again, November the 18th, Transgender Awareness Week. So look for something from me early next week. And again, everyone take this time to observe and enjoy American Indian Heritage Month throughout the state of North Carolina. Again, thank you
Wendy,
and have a good afternoon. Oh, yes, Greg.
Before you close out, you know, Catherine, we as Native people, we always have a gift. And of course, we have these restrictions on us in terms of how much a gift can be given and all those things. But we have something for you, and we're going to send that to you electronically. And what it will be is a copy of our 2021 Indian Heritage Month poster and a copy of Governor Cooper's Indian Heritage Month proclamation. So if you would share those items with Secretary Halen and your staff there at the thank you so much.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. That's wonderful. I will,
Thank you.
take
Very
them up in my
nice.
office
Very
and share
nice.
them with our teams. Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you. And we'll see
Bye.
everyone on November the 18th.